Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac, and today we're talking about wild blueberries. We're joined by our guest, Rachel Schattman, a researcher in wild blueberries at the University of Maine. Rachel shares her experiences from working as a vegetable farmer to becoming an authority in wild blueberry production, highlighting the ecological significance of these tiny but very mighty berries. As we navigate through the lush landscapes, Rachel provides invaluable insights into her climate change research, revealing how different genotypes of wild blueberries may adapt to evolving environmental conditions. We also explore the innovative farming techniques being adopted in wild blueberry cultivation, from prescribed fires, which may not be happening as much as I'd like, to other more eco-friendly mowing methods. Rachel sheds some light on challenges of water management faced by farmers and the divide between large, well-irrigated farms and smaller operations. As we dive into the broader implications of food security and sovereignty, Rachel offers a thought-provoking perspective on how wild food practices such as foraging and home gardening have surged during the COVID pandemic. We discuss the barriers to accessing public food and public lands and the complexities of land rights, focusing on Maine's pioneering path toward right to food legislation. I think this is a great conversation and dives into a lot of the big picture stuff we're always talking about within the context of this wild food. So I think you guys are going to really like this episode. So tune in, let us know what you think. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about blueberries as a New Englander who grew up around blueberries, who takes his kids foraging for wild blueberries. It's a great crop that has a really interesting history that is really hard to believe today that it's, historically speaking, a new domesticated crop because it's so popular, right? So tell me a little bit about your work and how you got into blueberries and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. My work has historically been not in blueberries. Before I moved to Maine, I worked in vegetables and small fruit for UVM Extension and for the USDA Northeast Climate Hub. And I also had my own commercial vegetable farm for about 11 years in Vermont. Since moving to Maine to take my current position at the University of Maine, I've gotten to know wild blueberries as a production system. And I think I just fell in love with blueberries in general. I didn't know what wild blueberries were until I moved here. I had heard of them. I knew they were smaller than high bush blueberries, but I didn't have an understanding for how different their growing environment was, how different their management was, and I didn't have as much of an appreciation for the rich cultural significance and kind of living culture that there is around them. So it's been a wonderful immersion over the last 4 or 5 years, getting to know them. I think one of the things that I find the most compelling about them is just how robust they are, how these plants can just weather extreme conditions and come through pretty well. Now, whether they continue to yield as many commercially saleable fruits as people whose livelihoods depend on them through the harsh conditions is another matter entirely. But just from an ecosystem perspective, they are really resilient and robust and can handle a lot. So that's part of what I find so amazing about them.
Yeah, I think blueberries are at least around here, I think are the most important pollinator bush for the ecosystem in terms of like diversity of pollinators that use them. It's something like wild, like 100, 120, somewhere in that ballpark of identified pollinators that use blueberry, which is just like crazy.
It is. It's amazing, isn't it? I have the good fortune of working with an entomologist here at UMaine named Phil Fanning, who is doing the pollinator research for some of my wild blueberry trials. And we were out in our plots this spring, and there were just a gazillion different types of bumblebees everywhere. And it was, considering the size of our trial, which is pretty small compared to some of these vast blueberry fields that you'll see in different regions of Maine, I was not expecting the number of pollinators or the diversity of pollinators to be there, but it is quite incredible.
Yeah, I mean, even here, I'm near the Pine Barrens, and if you look at it, like topically, the ecosystem doesn't look great when you go into the Pine Barrens because you've got these sparse pine trees, it seems kind of like this monocrop of wild blueberries, huckleberries, and then like openings where there's other stuff. But you're like, this can't be that good. But in reality, pines are also hugely beneficial pollinator trees. The scrub oaks that are here are also, they're oaks, so they're incredible too. And then blueberries also fit that like
Mm.
wide scope of pollinators or Vaccinium in general, so including the huckleberry. So there's deceivingly high support, ecosystem support from that structure, which I think is really interesting. And again, it's cool to see this bush that like we consume so easily as a wild food. There's no processing involved. It's not like a lot of other things where it's like, well, yeah, like acorns, you can eat acorns, but you have to do all this stuff to do it. And there's some debate about like the flavor quality. Like, no, you go outside and you pick a wild blueberry, it's delicious. Like, there's
Yeah.
nothing to it. You just have to be there. And that's like amazing to do that, and also the ecosystem stuff. It's like, wow, is this like the perfect bush or like what?
The answer is
You know?
yes. The answer
Yeah.
is yes. It is the perfect bush.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the trials that you're doing.
Sure, sure. So a lot of my work is in climate change research, both from a social science point of view and also from a field science point of view. From an, as you put it so well, ecosystem point of view, really. The main questions that my research team is asking right now that's relevant to wild blueberries is how are they going to fare both physiologically and in terms of the way that they support things like pollination in ecosystems considering climate change. So we have set up an experiment here in Old Town, Maine, where we have transplanted blueberry plants of different genotypes into an experimental design, and then we apply treatments, which are heating chambers and different precipitation treatments. It looks crazy. It looks like the aliens have landed on this old cornfield. What it looks like. Basically, we have these mounds of gravel that we have put because blueberries do well in very, very well drained, coarse soils that we have then laid the blueberry sod on top of and mulched, and then put plexiglass chambers that are open at the top over a third of the berries. So that will kind of create an elevated ambient temperature without cooking them. And then another third get those chambers plus a heating coil. So we actually have electricity out in the field and we're elevating the temperature to a higher degree. And every plot is covered with a little greenhouse. It's about 12 feet by 12 feet in some of our experiments. Some of our experiments, they're smaller, 6 foot by 6 foot. And that is designed to not keep out all the weather, but to exclude kind of most of the rainfall that's happening. But then we go in with a hose and a meter and we apply, irrigation, but basically simulated rainfall that is aligned with really, really wet year, a really, really dry year, or something that we are calling a probable future scenario, which is the amount of water that we get in a really, really wet year like 2023, which I bet it was the same for you as it was for us up here, just incredibly wet. We get that amount of water with the seasonal distribution of 2020, which for us was a big drought year. We started out, relatively okay. And then in the later part of the summer, just had long periods with no rainfall. And that is
like this year.
Exactly. So that's kind of what we're anticipating future conditions might look like. More rain overall over the course of the year, but many more periods of these kind of extended dry seasons. So the things we are looking at, we call them the response variables, are things like the number of stems that the blueberry plants put out, the number of leaves, the total leaf area, how well those leaves are photosynthesizing. We have a wonderful mycologist on our team named Shauna Annis who's looking at the mycorrhizal associations with the blueberry roots and seeing if there are any differences with the different treatments that we're applying. And then, of course, things like yield, fruit quality, fruit quantity. I think I mentioned Phil Fanning's work on pollination. So he's looking at the number of visitations of bees, the nectar quality, all sorts of things, but really trying to take a full ecosystem approach to it.
Awesome. And I'm assuming you don't have results yet, but I'm curious what you're so far seeing.
Yeah, we don't have any results yet. But what we do have are preliminary studies that our team did kind of in preparation of this project. So The heating chambers without the precipitation treatments are a design by a scientist named Yongjing Zhang, who is in our School of Biology and Ecology. And he has used these chambers in field settings and has kind of verified that they do in fact change the temperature, and that it changes things like the timing of bloom, the duration of bloom, which are, really important for people who are commercially managing these plants. I did some preliminary work in the precipitation arena with strawberries rather than blueberries, looking to see, and we also did a study with blueberries, looking to see how different precipitation patterns may or may not affect things like photosynthetic ability of the plants, chlorophyll concentration of the leaves. And what we found is that there are differences, but those differences might be mediated by the different genotypes of the plants themselves. So for folks who haven't seen like a full wild blueberry barren is what they're called, they're quite beautiful, but you can look out on the landscape and see different color hues across this like patchwork of low-lying blueberry plants. They're not planted, they don't grow in rows. It's just like a single mat that goes out across a whole, large acreage. Every time you see a shift in color, that's a different plant. So these plants are like 25 feet square. They're huge. And each plant we assume is a genetic individual. So there's really been no research done about how the genetic differentiation between these plants influences things like their ability to withstand drought, their ability to withstand extreme storms or saturated soil. There's a lot to do there, but that's part of what we are also trying to figure out is how much it has to do with how these plants are responding to climate change.
Yeah, so give it to me straight. Are we screwed?
I cannot tell you that. Ask me again in 4 years.
Okay. Like, am I going to have blueberries in 25 years?
Well, again, the question is for what purpose? So will these plants survive? As I said at the beginning of our conversation, I think they will. They are incredibly tough plants. And if you are going out and doing subsistence foraging, if you are looking for blueberries and not having it be your commercial business, I think you're going to have blueberries for the foreseeable future. If you are a grower and you're depending on it for your livelihood, then you always have to ask yourself the question, does the investment justify the return? And I think everybody's situation is so different. There are so many different kinds of wild blueberry farms, and I'm sure in the high bush blueberry industry, it's the same thing. People vary by the amount of capital that they put into the business, the amount of risk they can withstand, what kind of market they're a part of really, really depends on kind of their ultimate return. So I think that's part of what I'm trying to do with my research is get the industry some hard numbers that they can look at it and put into their own business model so they can make that determination for themselves.
And now, given the whole climate change component and the research that you're doing, do you foresee that there will be a little bit more human selection with wild blueberries, given like that I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that climate change will cause some kind of bottleneck sounds too extreme, but like some compression of that genetics as very specific traits for these irregularities, warming climates does shift what can survive and thrive in these environments?
That's a good question. I really don't have many insights into how the high bush blueberry industry is thinking about this. I imagine that they are thinking about variety selection in a way that creates a more robust and resilient industry.
Yeah.
For wild blueberries, there's no variety breeding that happens because this is a wild crop.
You don't think there will be?
I haven't heard of anyone moving in that direction. My crystal ball is very foggy. And there are a lot of people who are doing really interesting work in wild blueberries, both in the US, in Maine, but also in maritime Canada, where it's a very important crop. Dalhousie University has a really strong research team. So I don't know if somebody somewhere is thinking about genetic improvements and turning this into a planted crop. I don't
Mm.
see a way to do it currently with the technology that we have that would make financial sense. We definitely got questions when we started our project about whether or not we were aiming to do variety selections. But the cloning potential, it would have to happen over such an extended period of time. These plants don't like propagate super quickly. So I would say there's not anything coming out soon.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm just thinking more like if there's a lot, well, I don't know. I mean, if there's a lot of genetic diversity, then hopefully whatever die off exists from extreme climate events is filled in. But
Mm.
also, to your point, blueberries, wild blueberries, are such slow growing plants. It does, it's a question of like, can these slow growing plants with wide genetic diversity overcome those repeated once in a lifetime events that will probably continue to happen over the next century?
Well, again, I'm not sure that we have any evidence that die off is really in the future.
You don't know? That's good.
I don't think so. Not for wild blueberries. I think the concern is more economic profitability. And so let's like imagine a future where some proportion of wild blueberry lands are no longer commercially viable. From an ecosystem perspective, those lands will just kind of continue in through their like succession, right? Or they'll be, put towards a different land use, which is a whole other conversation.
Mm.
But I think that the industry has like a long way to go before they reach that point. There is, because so many wild blueberry soils are so well drained, severe rainstorms, which are a problem for a whole lot of ag sectors, affect them a little bit less dramatically. Drought is really the big thing for them, but a lot of wild blueberry farms haven't invested in irrigation yet. So, they've got like some big guns to pull out before I
Mm.
think we start to see huge shifts in the industry.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's comforting.
Yeah, I think so too.
One thing I wanted to ask, and I didn't include this when we were chatting earlier, have you been involved with any fire management techniques, and kind of if you've gotten any feedback from the utility of prescribed fires?
Oh, that's so interesting. I know that prescribed fires and burning was one of the ways that traditionally wild blueberry fields were managed. But this far predates my
Mm.
kind of moving to this area. My understanding is that there was some real air quality concerns and that there was some state legislation that addressed it. And now it's much more common for people to mow their wild blueberry crop, to do that every other year pruning that
Mm.
most commercial growers do in order to ensure good production the following year. For your listeners that don't know, the wild blueberry crop is only harvested every other year. And after harvesting, every fall that you harvest, you then go in after the leaves drop and prune back the entire crop by mowing it.
Yeah.
I know some people still burn. I don't know how prevalent it is, though.
Yeah, I was curious because it does seem like the prescribed fire concept has been catching on
Mm,
the last 5 or 10 years or so. So I wasn't sure if it had made its way back up to Maine
yeah.
as people realize like it is a very effective tool for all of, the air quality issues and so on. It is really good at doing what it's supposed to do.
It is. Well, I mean, there are trade-offs, right? Like,
Yeah.
yes, it's fabulous at controlling disease. Hooray. Boo, it like destroys all of your organic matter, at least at the very surface. So like there's no perfect management practice in any
Mm.
agricultural system. You're always gonna give something up and when you gain something.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like you're cautiously optimistic about the future of the wild blueberry. Is that correct?
I am. Yeah. Yeah. I think every agricultural industry is going to be challenged by climate change. There's this like no way that you can have such intense ecological shifts without, businesses and livelihoods that are based in natural resources in the environment. Like, of course, they're going to be affected. I think the question is, do they have the resources that they need to adapt? And, adaptation can happen at different degrees or to different degrees. So some industries are going to get pushed past their capacity to adapt. I don't think wild blueberries are one of those industries.
And what's been the feedback from farmers when talking about, like, well, hey, this is kind of what the future of wild blueberries may look like, and here's some of the tools that we think are probably your best efforts. Have they been very resistant to it, or is it becoming obvious that the way things are going probably is not indefinite?
It's a great question. I know it's different in different parts of the country, but my experience with farmers across a lot of different sectors in Maine are that climate change is at the front of everybody's awareness. It might not be the thing that drives everybody's decision making all the time, but most people are aware that conditions are changing. I did a series of focus groups on behalf of the Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry a couple years ago about experiences with drought across different ag sectors. Obviously, there's some self-selection there and who decides to come to those conversations. But I think it's safe to say that across all ag industries, potato, blueberry, vegetable, livestock, everybody sees the environment changing. A lot of those conversations were very specifically about water management, which is one of the areas that I focus on most closely because I think it's such a huge deal for agriculture in the context of climate change. Wild blueberry growers are kind of divided into two groups. From that perspective, the folks who have already invested in irrigation, which are in the minority, but also manage, the people who have invested and who can afford to invest tend to manage much larger pieces of land. And smaller operations, some of whom have some irrigation capacity, but a lot of whom don't. One of their big challenges in Maine is their ability to develop water sources. So to sink a well and have it yield anything that is actually going to be meaningful for their crop. And then, of course, the irrigation, piping, and delivery system on top of that. The state of Maine, I think, recognizes this as a need, and they set up a new program that's in the final stages of being kind of rolled out called the Farmer Drought Relief Program. And this was kind of under the auspices of which I was doing these focus groups, was to get information about how the state could best roll out this price support program. And I think one of the things that's very cool about it is that it is going to make funds available to farmers to first do their planning process. So like, how much water do you actually need to meet your crop's needs? A lot of people don't know the answer to that. How would you size a pond, or where would you site a well? All the logistical parts and pieces, part agronomic, part engineering, it all needs to come together before you sink a lot of money into actually developing a water source or putting in an irrigation system. The thing I will say about that program is that it needs to be funded by the legislature to the proportion of need. And I think I could say this because I'm outside of DACF. I think it's underfunded currently, and I would advocate for additional state support.
Yeah, that sounds about...
I'll stop with that.
Yeah, that sounds about right for most things that are climate change related. Just a little underfunded.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's not going to get any better. And it's talking about this on November 6th is particularly disenfranchising.
Well, actually, can I say something about that before you
move
go
for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think one of the most amazing things that has happened in recent years for agriculture and climate change is the funds that were allocated to USDA through the Inflation Reduction Act. I have a friend Caleb Goosen at MOFGA, who referred to it as agriculture's New Deal moment. And I think he was really spot on with that analogy. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, which operates in every state and makes funding available to farmers to use conservation practices on their farms, got just this incredible slog of extra funding to the point where they had to really hire a lot more people in order to make sure that they could reach the farmers who needed access to those funds to do things that were specifically related to climate change mitigation. And that was really powerful, in part because a lot of mitigation practices can double as adaptation practices, right? They're not always
Yeah.
one-to-one. Adaptation does not equal mitigation, but in the ag world, there are some things that overlap. So that slug of funding has been, and I think will continue to be, tremendously impactful for agriculture in the Northeast and across the country. What that looks like going forward, considering the election result, I cannot say. But I think we'll see the ripple effects of the money that has already been spent in the coming years.
That's awesome. I live near lots of cranberry bogs, and because of that, I have such a contentious relationship with certain types of agricultural funding because a lot of I don't know what you know about cranberry as a crop. I'm assuming a bit, but they produce much more than we need, and a lot of it is just the continuation of growing cranberries because the land has been specifically designed for that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, this giant subsidy for this industry that doesn't really need it just because of like this quote unquote cultural value and kind of keeping these jobs where they exist. And given the ecological destruction that has happened in places like Eastern Massachusetts, it is a bit frustrating to not see that money being reallocated to rewilding efforts. That would be really beneficial. But especially with the work you're doing, where it's like these are wild environments, and to an extent, cranberry bogs can be considered somewhat of a, comparatively to like a veg crop or wheat or whatever, a more wild environment. So it is like, hey, would you rather have a monocrop of corn here? No.
Mm-hmm.
This is objectively better, but also it is kind of a tenuous thing to like look at and say, I'm glad that it's not being turned into subdivisions, but also like this is not the ideal use for it either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it is interesting to hear that. I haven't heard a whole lot about the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of agriculture. And how has that affected your industry, like in the special, like specifically the wild blueberry area?
Well, it's interesting because I serve on the NRCS technical committee, which is people who are not USDA employees for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
We serve kind of like as an advisory body to NRCS to keep them connected with the needs of local growers or the kind of perspectives of the broader ag community in their state. So it's a really interesting group to be a part of to hear both firsthand what NRCS is contending with this kind of giant influx of funds that they then need to distribute out to different groups in the agricultural, but also to hear people's perspectives on the best use of those funds, in so much as there's flexibility, which there isn't like a ton of flexibility to kind of alter the course of the money.
Mm.
My understanding from Maine NRCS is that they would like to be directing more Inflation Reduction Act funds and conservation funds to the wild blueberry industry than they have. They also recently just awarded a grant called an RCPP, a resource conservation partnerships project grant to the Wild Blueberry Commission of Maine to the tune of $15.5 million. That is the largest grant that the industry has ever received, to my knowledge, and its entire effort will be based around increasing access to conservation practices and NRCS support to wild blueberry growers, a lot of it around water management. So it's a huge success, and I think a huge step forward for the industry in the state. I think other industries have historically felt a little bit more comfortable accessing NRCS programs, partially because a lot of conservation practices that NRCS will support have to do with soil and kind of sustainable and conservation-minded management of soil. But wild blueberries don't till, or wild blueberry growers don't till. They don't manage their kind of soil resources in as intensive a way as, say, a potato grower or a vegetable grower.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I said, where I live, there's tons of blueberries. And I used, for a long time, had sheep, and I would just let them browse over the blueberries every couple of years, and they would do the same thing.
Great pruning technique.
It is. They loved it, and like it was a win-win. Like you'd see them all come down in nubs, and you're like, oh man, they hit those pretty hard. Are they going to come back? But the next year they come right back.
They probably loved it.
They, you can tell. You deal with blueberries a lot, but for folks that don't, you can look at a blueberry bush and you can tell pretty quickly whether or not it's been pruned
Yeah.
like a year or two before or not. And if it hasn't, it just kind of looks like worn down.
Yes.
It's like the only, like it's splotchy, it's very woody, the material of it. And then the next year it comes back and you can tell it's kind of got like that nice fresh vigor to it.
Yep.
The leaves are usually like lighter green. There's just like more life to the plant. And it's like, oh, you were happy this happened to you.
Yes.
and like it's very obvious when you see them next to each other. Like if I have the fence line one spot, I could tell like, all right, this is the side I grazed last year just because of the coloring on the plant.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely spot on.
So I want to shift gears a little bit as we're talking about more topical stuff. So you've been also involved in some research around food security, which I think dovetails really well with this idea of wild foods. I don't know if you could speak a little bit about that and maybe how this all is part of this like greater narrative about food access, wild foods, and all, I guess, like this bigger picture of like what autonomy, what responsibility, what ownership do people have on the landscape in these communities where, with the case of wild blueberries, there's this very long historical component of access to land and also like this idea of like having relations with the landscape, right?
I love this line of questioning. Let me take it piece by piece. So, yes, I have been involved in a really interesting, very collaborative research initiative that has been led out of the University of Vermont by Meredith Niles, looking at food insecurity experiences after COVID. And the project started out as a very multi-site investigation. We had lots and lots and lots of different collaborators from across the country. And I think we published a paper in 2021 that kind of compared across the United States what people's experiences were with not just food insecurity post-COVID, but job loss, where they were going to get food, whether that was grocery stores or other sources, their interactions with the charitable food system, with programs like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Food Assistance Program, or there was a special pandemic version of SNAP that upped people's benefits and made benefits more widely accessible. So all of those kind of coping strategies following the pandemic. Since 2020, I've continued working with that group, but in a much more geographically narrowed range. So we focus mostly on Vermont and Maine as two New England states. And our research has revised and reissued that same survey. So we have some ability to look back in time and compare people's experiences from 2020 onward. Our most recent iteration of that survey was just this past summer. And then we've also been interviewing folks, and we'll start another round of interviews actually this week, looking at people's responses and coping mechanisms. And the reason that we're doing this is both because I think our initial surveys raised some really compelling questions about how people were accessing food, and specifically how they were gardening, hunting, fishing, foraging, canning, all of these activities that we group under the term home and wild food procurement. And we can just call home and wild food for the purpose of this conversation. But also because we expect that after any kind of big social or economic disruption, that there's going to be shifts in how people get their food, and that will have a kind of residual effect over time. We saw this with the Great Recession in 2008 as well. There was this big drop-off in food security that slowly rebounded, much more slowly than other economic indicators, which I think is important. So what we are looking into now is really kind of how people's experience with food insecurity does or does not interact with their willingness and ability to do these home and wild food practices. Now, not all of these practices, I think, are equally accessible to people. So, for example, one of the things that we've found that is maybe a little bit of a common sense outcome is that a lot of people practice gardening for the first time after the pandemic, or they did it more than they had done in the past. It's fairly economically non-intensive to get started with gardening. You can get seeds, pretty cheaply at the grocery store or the hardware store. People might not know you can actually use SNAP benefits to buy seeds, and some people do that. And you need a container with a little bit of soil, or if you live in a rural area, you're probably more likely to have access to an actual place where you can put a garden in. Things like hunting and fishing that require permits and require equipment and require skills and knowledge, there's a bigger barrier to access. Now, some of these skills and kind of cultural norms around these types of practices are very well rooted in rural communities. So, people are practicing them all the time, but it's harder to get into for the first time. And that's an example of some of the dynamics that we started to see through our studies. I was originally trained as a qualitative social scientist, which means doing things like interviews and focus groups, which allow people to really kind of get into the nitty gritty of why they do what they do and what they think. The important thing to remember with that kind of study is that it's not representative of wide swaths of people. But what I really love is hearing people's stories about why they might start relying more on gardening or fishing or hunting or foraging. And there's I think, some important lessons that we have been learning and hearing, and it has to do with how prevalent food insecurity really is in our country. It's something that I think a lot of people don't see and don't think about and don't hear about, but it's very much with us. And something like COVID really kind of brought it to the forefront of, I think, more people's minds and certainly more people's lived experiences. And now I'm just rambling, so you should stop me.
No, it's really interesting. And, I did kind of try to bring these kind of disparate ideas together into one question, because I do think this is kind of, and I may be stepping on your toes a little bit, the future of, as you continue to do this research, kind of where does that communal aspect of like, hey, we're talking about a wild food that has a long history for not just industry. Well, it has a fairly short history of industry, but a long history of communal access that has been privatized, even though there are still some protected lands. And like the reason why people harvested blueberries 100 years ago was because you could can them, you could store them for long-term storage. It offered food security that was free, despite all it took was time and really not a lot of skill. It's not rocket science to create jam or to jar something or to freeze something today. So it does offer a way to mitigate some of those issues that you're bringing up. And it also relates to the fact that you do have this industry that exists, and how do you pair a wild food industry with a community that also has historically relied on that same wild food? You almost can't talk about one without talking about the other on a longer timeline where increasing food security exists.
Absolutely. I think you really make excellent points. And I think that this is also something that comes up a lot when we think about tribal access to traditional lands and ability to continue food sovereignty practices and food security practices for their communities. I think all of these issues that you bring up are really important in that conversation as well.
Yeah. So do you have any thoughts about kind of where, I don't want to put you on the spot, but also you are very knowledgeable about both sides of this coin. Kind of how do you see this kind of moving forward, or are you seeing it going in, like, do you have like an inkling that there's like this trajectory of like a nexus point where something has to shift, or that things are shifting?
In terms of like privatization of land and its and people's willingness to allow for food subsistence activities on it?
Yeah, and like how, to your point about like COVID, there's also been an influx in foraging as like like popular activity for younger people, especially, that are like, this is a way for me to re-engage with the world. I had a month off at the beginning of COVID. I didn't know what to do. I was worried about food. I started following this person on TikTok, whatever it might be, right? And suddenly they're like, I love going out and harvesting blueberries and huckleberries and chanterelles and, whatever it might be. They've created this new engagement with the landscape. And suddenly when you have that engagement with the landscape, you notice more that, all this land that I could be harvesting on are privatized, or they're federally owned but contracted out as used for this company that is paid for the rights to this access.
Sure.
And given, again, that inflation, food inflation, all these things are happening right now, it seems like we're entering this point where this is going to become eventually a point of contention from all the perspectives you brought up, from an indigenous access point, from a industry that is going to struggle with profitability and have to put greater investment in making these farms profitable, and then individuals that are more interested in access and the ability to feed themselves, right?
Yeah.
You've got these three disparate lines that are kind of going to the same point of limited access to the land. And I'm curious, in the terms of us, the resident specialist, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, so I think it's a lot of important ethical questions that you're raising. I do not see the kind of function of private property changing in the Northeast in any kind of meaningful way. I do have friends who work here who have moved from out west to find themselves a little at a loss, and they're like, where are my public lands? Where do I go? We're very much in a private land dominated space in the Northeast. And the reason that I say that I don't see this shifting is that we have some pretty kind of novel, at least for the US, legislation that has been enacted in the last like 5-10 years that specifically addresses our ability to eat what we want to eat, forage what we want to forage, hunt what we want to hunt. In Maine, I don't know if you're aware of the right to food legislation that was passed a few years ago, the food sovereignty law. We were the first state in the country to pass one. And I was searching around to pull it up so I could read it, at least a relevant passage aloud to you if you'll humor me.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It says, all individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to food, including the right to save and exchange seeds and the right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their own choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being, as long as an individual does not commit trespassing, theft, poaching, or other abuses of private property rights, public lands, or natural resources in the harvesting, production, or acquisition of food. So this law is very much just beginning to be tested in the courts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are some really interesting legal arguments, I think, to be made. One of the earliest court cases had to do with the ban that Maine has Sunday hunting. You're not allowed to hunt in Maine on Sundays. And the plaintiff basically argued that that was disrupting their food sovereignty, their ability to access food. The plaintiff did not win because the state was able to argue successfully that Sunday hunting constituted poaching and therefore was excluded from the Food Sovereignty Act. But I think we'll continue to run into these interpretive questions. The act itself is pretty vague and a very large umbrella that I think folks are going to look at very carefully in the coming years and try to see if they can use it in many different ways and many different interpretations. But to your point, property rights are very much protected even within this kind of new, fragile, cutting-edge statutory guidance.
Yeah.
What occurs to me, though, is that I have never run into folks here who didn't feel like they could ask someone for permission to hunt on their land or ask someone for permission to forage on their land. And I think we can't rely too much on state laws to supplant personal relationships, and that there's still a really significant respect for people's ability to access their own food, at least in our part of the Northeast. It might be different where you are, and certainly I imagine it might be different in more highly urbanized areas where fewer people have kind of a long-standing practice of things like foraging or gardening or hunting or whatever. But at least up here, it doesn't seem like people are feeling like their food sovereignty is being challenged by lack of access to land. I think what they feel more challenged by, and I had a student who brought this up in class yesterday in such a clear way, where he said, So many waterways in Maine are contaminated with PFAS, and that's been documented, and you really shouldn't be eating the fish out of there. I feel like my food sovereignty is being diminished by PFAS contamination, and who's responsible for that? And I think that's brilliant foresight into what the future might hold in terms of like environmental regulation or litigation.
I think it's a really good point. And as you were talking, I was thinking about two things. The first being that Maine, I believe from my friends that hunt there, you actually can hunt anywhere unless somebody explicitly tells you you can't, which is a really interesting way to do things. And to your point, like people still do ask for permission, even though they don't have to, because it does set a certain expectation of, clear boundaries and respect and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part of that is that we have the same issue here in Massachusetts with waterways being contaminated and that's because of mills. And I grew up in a mill city that is now the home of a Superfund site. So it's not great. And certain neighborhoods near where I grew up have absurdly high rates of rare cancers and things like that. And that is really disheartening when you say, like, I want to go catch some fish and I want to eat them because I want to have this relationship. And the Massachusetts basically says in these certain ponds and rivers, which is basically all of them on the East Coast, they do not recommend eating more than like one fish a month. And honestly, I would say that is being generous. And it's really sad. And to your point, it is an infringement on our rights as citizens in a landscape to not have access to it in all of these ways that humans have historically been able to.
I so agree. Absolutely.
So, Rachel, this has been a really fascinating talk. For folks that want to learn more about the research you guys are doing, want to see updates on your cool greenhouses, any of that fun stuff, where can I send them to?
So we have a website for our group that describes a lot of our work, both our research and our outreach. We run programs for farmers and agricultural advisors as well. And the website is agroecolab.com, agroecolab.com. So people can check us out there.
Awesome. And if people want to get involved, they live in Maine, they love blueberries, is there anything they can do to help you guys out? I'm sure there's always a need for some free labor.
We always have volunteer opportunities. So yes, there's a contact us form on the website. They should just reach out and we'll put them on our list.
Awesome. Rachel, this has been really fun. I'm looking forward to seeing what the results of your studies are, and I'm sure we will cross paths soon again.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.